The year was 2247, and Earth had been peaceful for 3 generations now, and humanity had finally united under something called the Terran Council. And it felt good to be alive during these times because people had colonized Mars and set up mining operations in the asteroid belt and even sent ships to explore the outer planets, and everything seemed perfect until that day, when everything changed forever. Admiral Connor Hayes was 47 years old, and he commanded the orbital defense station called Sentinel Prime, and his job was to monitor the edges of the solar system and watch for threats that honestly never came, and he had spent most of his career preparing for dangers that existed only in training simulations. And sometimes he wondered if all this preparation was even necessary, but he stayed ready anyway because that was his duty. And his daughter Sophie served as a communications officer aboard a destroyer called the Valiant, and she patrolled near Jupiter's moons, and Connor was proud of her, even though they didn't see each other much anymore. Dr. Lucas Grant worked at the Farside Lunar Observatory, and he was the chief astronomer there, and he spent his nights looking at stars and tracking objects in space. And on this particular night, he detected something strange, and it was an anomaly at the edge of the Kuiper Belt, and something massive was slowing down from faster-than-light travel, and Lucas couldn't believe what his instruments were showing him, because the object was enormous, and it was roughly the size of Earth's moon, and what made it worse was that it wasn't alone because 12 smaller vessels accompanied it, and each of those smaller ships was still bigger than anything humans had ever built. Within just a few hours, the truth became clear and undeniable, and humanity was not alone in the universe, and this first contact was not happening on humanity's terms at all, and people all over Earth and Mars and the orbital colonies started to panic when the news spread, and governments scrambled to figure out what to do, and military forces went on high alert, and everyone waited to see what these visitors wanted. The alien fleet transmitted a message, and it came through in perfect English and Chinese and Arabic, and every major human language all at the same time, and they called themselves the Valorian Collective, and they explained that they were a union of 17 different species, and they had maintained order in this part of the galaxy for over 10,000 years, and their message was simple, but it sent chills down everyone's spine because it was not a greeting of peace and friendship, like humans had always imagined first contact would be. The Valorians said that Earth had been observed and humanity had been judged, and the species showed too much aggression and too much desire to expand and too much potential to disrupt the order that the collective had carefully maintained, and they had dealt with species like humanity before, and they knew how to handle the situation, and the ultimatum was clear and terrifying, because they demanded that humanity submit to collective oversight and surrender all sovereignty or face complete extinction, and they gave humanity exactly 72 hours to decide. President Elena Martinez called an emergency session of the Terran Council, and representatives from every nation and colony gathered, and the debate was fierce and loud and emotional, because some people argued that humanity should submit, because there was no way they could defeat a civilization that had mastered faster-than-light travel and commanded the resources of 17 different worlds. And other people, led by General Nathan Cross, insisted that freedom was worth any price, and that submission was not an option, no matter what the cost might be. Connor Hayes watched all of this from Sentinel Prime, and he knew that whatever decision the Council made, his station would be the first line of defense if it came to war, and he sent a priority message to Sophie, telling her that he loved her, and that she should trust in humanity's ability to survive anything, and he hoped she would be safe, but he knew that hoping wasn't enough. The Terran Council voted, and it was nearly unanimous, and President Martinez delivered humanity's response to the Valorian Collective, and her voice was steady and strong when she said that humanity would not submit and would not surrender, and if the Valorians wanted Earth, they would have to take it by force, and every human who heard those words felt a mixture of pride and terror because they knew war was coming. With only 3 days until the deadline, humanity mobilized faster than ever before, and every warship was recalled to Earth orbit, and manufacturing centers on the Moon and Mars shifted to producing weapons instead of civilian goods. And Lucas Grant and his team of scientists worked desperately to analyze the alien vessels and look for any weakness they could find. And what they discovered was not encouraging at all. The Valorian ships used energy shields that could deflect kinetic weapons and absorb most energy-based attacks, and their propulsion systems suggested they had power generation capabilities far beyond anything humanity could create and the smallest. Valorian frigate had more firepower than Earth's largest battleship, and the odds were impossible, but humanity had never backed down from impossible odds before. Connor Hayes worked around the clock coordinating the defense fleet positioning, and he had 32 warships under his command, and 15 of them were light frigates that were barely suited for real combat, and against 12 Valorian vessels. Plus their massive mothership, the odds seemed hopeless, but Connor had a plan forming in his mind, and it relied on the one thing humanity had always been good at, which was adapting and improvising and finding creative solutions to impossible problems. Sophie Hayes and the crew of the Valiant rushed back from Jupiter, and they pushed their engines to maximum, and they knew they would arrive just hours before the deadline expired, and Sophie was scared, but she was also determined because her father had taught her that fear was natural, but courage was choosing to act despite the fear. The 72 hours passed quickly, and when the deadline expired, the Valorian fleet began moving toward Earth, and they moved at a steady and unhurried pace that showed absolute confidence in their victory, and they broadcast one final message, telling humanity that their defiance had been noted and was irrelevant, and they should prepare for occupation. Connor Hayes took a deep breath and gave the order, and the human defense fleet moved to intercept, and they spread out in a formation that looked tactically wrong to most military observers, but Connor knew what he was doing, and Lucas Grant transmitted targeting data to every ship, and his team had identified what they believed might be weak points in the Valorian shield systems. As the two fleets got closer, every person on Earth and Mars and in the orbital colonies watched the live video feeds, and they knew they were witnessing either humanity's finest hour or its final moment, and parents held their children close, and people prayed to whatever gods they believed in, and soldiers checked their weapons one last time. The Valorian fleet opened fire first, and bright beams of energy cut through the darkness of space, and humanity's greatest test had begun. The Valorian weapons were beyond anything humanity had ever seen, and coherent plasma beams tore through space and struck human shields with devastating force, and the frigate Aurora exploded in the very first attack, and 300 people died in that single instant, and their deaths were just the beginning of the horror that was about to unfold. Connor Hayes felt his heart sink when he saw the Aurora disappear from his tactical display, but he couldn't afford to grieve right now, because thousands more lives depended on his decisions, and he ordered the fleet to execute a maneuver pattern he had designed specifically for this moment, and the human ships scattered in all directions and regrouped in patterns that seemed random but were actually carefully calculated to confuse the Valorian targeting systems. The Valiant entered the battle with Sophie Hayes at her communications station, and the ship's captain was Commander Lisa Park, and she was a veteran with 20 years of experience, and she ordered a full missile barrage while pushing the engines to maximum thrust. And most of the missiles were destroyed by Valorian point defense weapons, but 3 missiles reached their target and exploded against a Valorian cruiser's shields, and the shields flared bright blue, but they held firm and didn't collapse. Lucas Grant's research data proved valuable because he had discovered that by concentrating fire on specific points of the Valorian shields, human weapons could create temporary overloads, and the battleship Defiant, commanded by Captain Ryan Foster, coordinated with 2 frigates to focus all their main cannons on a single spot of a Valorian destroyer's shield, and the combined firepower was incredible. The shield collapsed for exactly 2.3 seconds, and in that brief window, the Defiant's railgun rounds punched through the alien hull, and the Valorian destroyer didn't explode, but it started venting atmosphere and spinning out of control, and it fell out of formation completely crippled, and it was humanity's first real victory against the collective. But the cost was terrible, because the 2 frigates that had helped with the attack were destroyed by Valorian return fire, and 600 more people died. Admiral Hayes made a decision that he had been considering since the battle began, and he ordered Sentinel Prime to leave its safe orbital position and join the fight directly, and the massive defense station was not designed for combat maneuvering, but it had the most powerful reactors in the entire human fleet, and Connor had a plan that he had shared with absolutely no one, because he knew they would try to stop him. As Sentinel Prime began moving toward the Valorian mothership, Sophie Hayes was monitoring fleet communications, and she suddenly realized what her father was planning to do, and her blood ran cold because she understood that his plan was a suicide mission, and she broke communication protocol and transmitted directly to his command channel, and her voice was shaking when she said that there had to be another way. Connor's response was calm and steady, and he told her to tell her mother that he loved her and that this was the only way to win. And he said that humanity survived because people were willing to stand between the darkness and the light. And today, that was his job, and Sophie was crying, but she couldn't say anything else because her father had already closed the channel. Sentinel Prime accelerated toward the Valorian mothership, and Connor directed all power to the forward shields, and the entire station shook from the strain. And the Valorian mothership targeted Sentinel Prime with multiple plasma batteries, and the beams hammered against the station's shields, and Connor had timed his approach perfectly, because the human fleet was concentrating all their fire on the mothership's shields at the same moment. The Valorian shields were already stressed from defending against the entire human fleet when Sentinel Prime impacted, and Connor had overloaded all three of the station's fusion reactors and turned Sentinel Prime into a massive kinetic missile with a payload measured in gigatons, and the explosion was so bright that it was visible from Earth even in daylight. The Valorian mothership's shields collapsed completely, and the massive explosion tore through half of the enormous vessel, and the mothership didn't explode entirely because alien engineering was incredibly robust, but it was crippled beyond any hope of repair, and it began drifting slowly out of Earth's orbit, trailing debris and leaking atmosphere. Sophie Hayes screamed when her father's life sign disappeared from her display, and she knew he was gone and she would never see him again. And Commander Park had to physically grab her shoulders and tell her to focus because the battle was not over yet, and Sophie forced herself to push down her grief and keep working, because that's what her father would have wanted. The Valorian collective forces were shocked by what had just happened, and they had lost their mothership and one destroyer, and 3 more ships were badly damaged, and they suddenly realized that humanity was far more dangerous than they had calculated, and the remaining Valorian vessels began withdrawing from the immediate battle zone, and they moved to a position beyond the moon's orbit where they held formation. The collective transmitted a new message, and their tone had changed from confident to cautious, and they acknowledged that humanity's resistance had been noted and stronger than expected, and they announced that they would return with reinforcements, and the collective estimated that their support fleet would arrive in 4 months, and when it did, Earth would face not 12 vessels, but 112 vessels, and then the transmission ended. The human fleet was badly damaged and reduced to only 17 functional warships, and over 4,000 people had died in the battle, including Admiral Connor Hayes, who was immediately declared a hero by President Martinez, and flags across Earth and Mars were lowered to half position, and memorial services began almost immediately. Sophie Hayes requested a transfer to Earth because she couldn't continue serving while her father's death was so fresh and raw, and Commander Park understood completely, and wrote a recommendation praising Sophie's performance, even under the most terrible personal circumstances, and Sophie was granted emergency leave. General Nathan Cross was promoted to Supreme Commander of Earth Defense Forces, and his first orders were to implement emergency war protocols, and he announced that every nation and every corporation and every resource on Earth and Mars would be directed toward one single goal, which was survival, and there would be no exceptions and no special privileges because humanity faced extinction. Lucas Grant was given unlimited funding and complete access to the wreckage of the destroyed Valorian destroyer, and he assembled a research team that included the best scientists from every field, and they had exactly 4 months to understand Valorian technology and find a way to level the playing field, or humanity would die. Earth began transforming into a fortress, and manufacturing facilities that had produced consumer goods switched to making weapons and ships and ammunition, and mining operations in the asteroid belt pushed beyond safety limits to extract raw materials, and people worked 18-hour shifts without complaint because everyone understood what was at stake. Sophie Hayes returned to her childhood home where her mother was waiting, and they held each other and cried for hours because Connor Hayes had been a husband and father and hero, and now he was gone, and the house felt empty without him. And Sophie looked at pictures of her father and promised herself that his sacrifice would not be meaningless and that she would find a way to make humanity survive. Dr. Lucas Grant stood inside the captured Valorian destroyer that was now attached to a new orbital platform called Research Station Nova, and the interior of the alien ship was both familiar and completely strange at the same time, because the basic design suggested that the Valorians understood physics the same way humans did, but their technology was centuries ahead of anything Earth had developed. His research team included Dr. Rachel Morse, who was a quantum physicist from Geneva, and Dr. James Kim, who was a materials scientist from Seoul, and Commander Alex Rivera, who was a military engineer with years of experience in reverse engineering, captured equipment, and together they began the slow and careful process of understanding how their enemy's technology actually worked. The first major discovery came from Rachel Morse after she had been studying the Valorian shield generators for 2 weeks straight, and she figured out that the shields didn't work by deflecting energy the way human shields did, but instead they created something called a controlled quantum field that redirected incoming force along extra-dimensional vectors, and it was technology that shouldn't be possible according to human physics. But here, it was working perfectly. James Kim discovered what the Valorian hull material was made of, and it turned out to be a crystalline metal lattice that was infused with exotic matter, and this made it lighter than titanium but stronger than diamond, and Earth couldn't reproduce it with current technology, but Kim believed that a simplified version could be manufactured using rare Earth elements and something called high-energy synthesis. Alex Rivera focused all his attention on the weapon systems, and he learned that the Valorian plasma cannons worked by containing fusion reactions in magnetic bottles and then releasing them in controlled bursts, and the technology wasn't actually beyond human capability. But the power requirements were enormous, and Rivera calculated that to power just one Valorian-style plasma cannon, a human warship would need to triple its reactor output. General Nathan Cross met with the research team every week, and he always brought Sophie Hayes with him even though she had requested a transfer to Earth. And Cross had made her his personal aide because he believed that Connor Hayes' daughter deserved to be part of the work her father had died for. Sophie was angry at first about being denied her transfer, but gradually she became invested in the research work, and she had inherited her father's tactical mind, and she began noticing patterns in the Valorian technology that other people missed, and she realized that the collective had optimized everything for power and durability, but not for speed or maneuverability, and their ships were like tanks that were powerful but slow. This observation led to a completely new human strategy, because if humanity couldn't match Valorian firepower, then they would have to outmaneuver them instead, and Cross authorized the construction of a new class of warship called the Raptor class Interceptor, and these ships would be small and fast and armed with missiles carrying shaped nuclear charges, and they would be humanity's answer to Valorian might. President Elena Martinez addressed the entire world in a broadcast that reached every human being on Earth and Mars, and in the orbital colonies, and she explained the situation without hiding anything or making it sound better than it was, and she told people that the Valorian collective was coming back with overwhelming force, and Earth would probably lose the coming battle, but surrender was not an option, because submission meant the end of human freedom forever. She announced something called the Fortification Initiative and explained that every resource would be directed to defense, and economic systems would be temporarily suspended, and manufacturing would focus only on weapons and ships and defensive platforms, and it was a level of coordination that humanity had never achieved, even during the terrible unification wars of the previous century. The response surprised even the most optimistic leaders because people across the entire globe volunteered to help, and engineers worked 18-hour shifts without being forced, and mining operations on Mars and in the asteroids pushed beyond every safety limit to extract raw materials, and factories on Earth produced weapons and ship components 24 hours a day, and humanity facing extinction was more united than it had ever been before. Thousands of civilian ships from cargo haulers to luxury yachts were retrofitted with whatever weapons could be installed, and their captains and crews volunteered to join what became known as the Volunteer Fleet. And these people knew they would probably die, but they volunteered anyway. Captain Morris Green was 70 years old and had spent his entire life moving cargo between Earth and Mars, and his ship was called the Steady Hand, and it was given a dozen missile pods and a crew that included his daughter and his son-in-law, and 2 grandchildren, and Morris had no illusions about his fleet's chances in battle, but he understood what needed to be done. Sophie Hayes visited the memorial where her father's name had been engraved in stone, alongside all the others who died in the first battle, and she placed her hand on the cold surface and made a promise that she would make his sacrifice mean something, and that humanity would survive. General Cross found her at the memorial and told her that her transfer request had been denied again, but this time he was assigning her to command one of the new Raptor-class interceptors, and it was a frontline combat position and one of the most dangerous assignments in the entire fleet, but Sophie accepted without any hesitation. With 2 months remaining until the Valorian fleet's estimated arrival, General Cross revealed his complete strategy to the Terran Council, and it was audacious and desperate, which was exactly what humanity needed right now. And the plan was that Earth would not wait for the Valorian fleet to reach the planet, but would intercept them near Mars instead. The civilian populations of the Mars colonies would be evacuated to Earth, and Mars itself would be equipped with weapons platforms, and the volunteer fleet would serve as a second wave supporting the military vessels and providing tactical flexibility. And the goal was not to win decisively, but to inflict enough damage that the Valorian collective would reconsider whether Earth was worth the cost. Lucas Grant presented his final contribution, which was a quantum disruption weapon based on Valorian shield technology, and it was experimental and might not work at all, but if successful, it could temporarily disable every Valorian shield in a large area, and the weapon required all the power from a capital ship's reactor, and could only be fired once before burning out completely. The battleship Hammer volunteered to carry the weapon, and its captain was Commander Olivia Stone, and she understood perfectly that firing the weapon would leave her ship defenseless and probably doomed, but she volunteered anyway because that's what humanity did when facing extinction. The final weeks before the battle were agonizing because humanity had done everything possible, and the fleet was assembled, and the weapons were loaded, and the volunteers had said their goodbyes, and now all they could do was wait. Sophie Hayes spent the final night before departure at her mother's home, and they didn't talk about Connor, and they didn't talk about the battle, and they just sat together holding hands in silence, because sometimes there were no words that could express what needed to be said. When morning came, Sophie returned to her Raptor-class interceptor, which she had named the Storm Chaser, and she ran her pre-flight checks and settled into the pilot's seat and waited for the order to launch, and she was ready. The Valorian fleet entered Mars orbit with the confidence of an army that had never known defeat, and their formation was tighter than it had been in the first battle, because they had learned from humanity's tactics, and this time they were not taking any chances, and the collective transmitted no messages because they had come to finish what they started, and words were no longer necessary. General Nathan Cross waited until the Valorian fleet committed to its approach vector, and then he triggered his first surprise and hidden weapons platforms on Mars, and on its 2 moons called Phobos and Deimos, opened fire all at once and railgun. Batteries and missile pods launched a coordinated attack that lit up the Martian sky like a second sunrise. The Valorian shields absorbed most of the damage just as Cross had expected, but the attack served its real purpose, which was to force the alien fleet to slow down and regroup, and in that brief moment of hesitation, the human fleet struck from multiple directions at once. Sophie Hayes led a squadron of 12 Raptor-class interceptors in a high-speed approach from above the Valorian formation, and the Raptors were so small and fast that Valorian targeting systems struggled to track them properly, and by the time the alien point defense activated, the Raptors had already launched their missiles. 48 nuclear-tipped missiles screamed toward the Valorian vessels, and the alien point defense destroyed 39 of them in seconds, but 9 missiles reached their targets, and the shaped charges focused the nuclear detonations into concentrated bursts that were designed specifically to overwhelm shield generators. 2 Valorian frigates suffered critical shield failures, and their protective barriers collapsed completely, and the human battleship Titan followed up immediately with its main cannons tearing into the exposed hulls, and both Valorian ships exploded in brilliant flashes of light and debris. Sophie pulled her squadron into a hard burn away from the battle using Mars gravity to slingshot around the planet, and her display showed that she had lost 3 Raptors to Valorian return fire, and 3 of her pilots were dead, and 9 remained under her command, and she ordered them to rearm and prepare for a second strike. Captain Morris Green and the volunteer fleet emerged from behind Mars, and they were a ragtag collection of civilian vessels moving in loose formation, and the Valorian fleet barely considered them a threat at first because they focused their fire on the military warships instead. This was exactly what Green had been counting on, and the civilian ships scattered in all directions, moving in patterns that seemed completely random, and they were not trying to engage the Valorian fleet directly, but instead they were deploying mines and creating debris fields and generally making the space around Mars as chaotic as possible. The tactic worked better than anyone had hoped, because a Valorian destroyer pursuing the human cruiser Defiance navigated straight into a dense cloud of proximity mines, and the first mine detonated against its shields, creating a brief overload, and the second mine slipped through the gap and impacted the hull directly, and the destroyer survived, but was forced to withdraw from the battle line for emergency repairs. Green's granddaughter was serving as his communications officer, and she reported that 6 civilian vessels had been destroyed already, and Green made careful note of their names, and he promised himself that if he survived, he would personally visit each of their families. Commander Olivia Stone watched the battle unfold from the bridge of the Hammer, and her orders were very clear, which was to wait for maximum Valorian fleet concentration and then fire the experimental quantum disruption weapon, and Lucas Grant was aboard her ship monitoring the weapon's status, and he estimated they would only get one chance to use it correctly. General Cross gave the signal at the exact moment he had calculated, and Stone ordered all power redirected to the quantum weapon, and the Hammer's engines went completely dark, leaving the massive battleship drifting helplessly, and every Valorian sensor suddenly registered the enormous power buildup, and multiple ships immediately redirected their fire toward the Hammer. Stone gave the command to fire, and the quantum disruption weapon released a pulse of energy that existed partially outside normal space-time, and it expanded in a perfect sphere, moving at the speed of light and washing over 37 Valorian vessels in just 3 seconds. Every Valorian shield in the affected area collapsed simultaneously, and for exactly 11 seconds, 1/3 of the Valorian fleet was completely vulnerable and defenseless. General Cross had positioned every available warship to exploit this exact moment, and his order went out to all ships telling them to fire everything they had, and the human fleet unleashed a devastating barrage. Railguns and missiles and plasma torpedoes and experimental weapons of every type tore into unprotected Valorian hulls, and the alien ships tried desperately to maneuver, but their heavier design worked against them now, and they were too slow to escape. Sophie Hayes brought her Raptor squadron in for their second strike, targeting a Valorian heavy cruiser that had lost both its shields and its propulsion, and her missiles punched through the hull, causing secondary explosions that tore the massive ship apart from the inside. The volunteer fleet, despite having suffered terrible losses, pressed forward with incredible courage, and Morris Green personally piloted the Steady Hand in a ramming attack against a Valorian frigate, and he had evacuated most of his crew to escape pods first, but he remained at the controls to ensure the trajectory was perfect, and the impact destroyed both ships in a massive explosion. When the 11 seconds expired and Valorian shields began to come back online, the damage to their fleet was catastrophic, and 18 Valorian vessels had been completely destroyed, and 12 more were crippled and drifting helplessly, and the Valorian fleet had lost nearly 1/3 of its total combat strength. The Hammer was defenseless after firing the quantum weapon, and it faced concentrated Valorian fire from multiple directions, and Commander Stone ordered evacuation, but she knew most of the crew would not make it to the escape pods in time. Lucas Grant refused to leave the ship, and he told Stone that he had built the weapon and should see what happened when the Valorians destroyed it, and the Valorian plasma beams tore through the Hammer's hull, and the quantum device exploded in a flash of exotic energy that briefly distorted space itself, and the Hammer broke apart, and 163 people died, including Grant and Stone. For the first time in their long history, the Valorian collective faced a decision they had not anticipated, and the human fleet, though badly damaged, remained combat effective, and Mars orbit was now a dangerous debris field, and humanity had demonstrated weapons technology that should not have been possible. The Valorian fleet commander made a tactical calculation and realized that the collective could still win this battle, but the cost would be extremely high, and more importantly, humanity had proven to be far more resourceful than any projections had predicted. The Valorian fleet began a fighting withdrawal toward the outer solar system, and they maintained formation and returned fire, destroying 3 more human warships in the process, but they were clearly retreating, and humanity had won. General Cross wanted to pursue them, but his officers convinced him that the human fleet was down to 41 combat-capable ships, and ammunition reserves were critically low, and they had won the battle but could not risk overextending their forces. The Valorian fleet transmitted a final message, and this time it was different from before, and they acknowledged humanity as warriors and offered one final option, which was to join the collective willingly, as equals, rather than subjects, and humanity would retain sovereignty in exchange for contributing to galactic stability. and if humanity refused, the collective would return with enough force to eliminate the species entirely, and humanity had 1 year to decide. Dr. Rachel Morse had taken over Lucas Grant's position after his death, and she was working day and night analyzing data from the destroyed Valorian vessels, and she made a breakthrough while examining communication logs that human quantum computers had finally managed to decrypt. What she discovered changed everything, because the Valorian collective was not the unified and powerful empire they had presented themselves as, and internal communications revealed a civilization dealing with resource shortages and political divisions between member species and military forces that were stretched dangerously thin, and the fleet sent to Earth was not a small portion of their strength, but actually represented a significant percentage of their total military capability. Even more important was that the collective's leadership was deeply divided about what to do with Earth, and several member species had argued against the entire operation, believing that humanity's ability to adapt made them too dangerous to conquer and too valuable to simply destroy. Sophie Hayes brought this intelligence to General Cross immediately, and he convened an emergency meeting of the Terran Council, because this information meant that humanity had more leverage than anyone had realized. President Elena Martinez listened carefully to the intelligence briefing, and she recognized an opportunity that could change everything. And if the Valorian collective was divided and weakened, then humanity could negotiate from a position of strength, and she tasked her diplomatic team with crafting a response that would neither submit to the collective nor guarantee another war. Ambassador Chenwei was Earth's most skilled negotiator, and he proposed what he called the third option, and instead of joining the collective as junior members or continuing to fight humanity, should offer an alliance of complete equals, and Earth would share its technological innovations in exchange for access to collective knowledge and resources, but both sides would maintain total sovereignty. The proposal was incredibly bold because it suggested that a single planet species could negotiate as equals with a civilization spanning 17 worlds, but humanity had demonstrated two things that could not be ignored, which were technological adaptability and absolute willingness to fight to extinction rather than submit. General Cross supported the diplomatic plan but insisted on having a backup strategy ready, and if negotiations failed, humanity must be prepared to fight again, and this time the outcome had to be decisive. In secret, Cross authorized construction of 5 massive vessels called Defiant-class dreadnoughts, and each ship would be built around a quantum disruption weapon, making them mobile platforms capable of disabling entire enemy fleets, and the project would consume enormous resources and require 8 months to complete, which was cutting it dangerously close to the 1-year deadline. Sophie Hayes was given command of the prototype Dreadnought's fighter wing, and she accepted the assignment knowing that if diplomacy failed, these ships would represent humanity's last hope for survival. 6 months after the second battle, President Martinez sent a delegation to meet with the Valorian collective at a neutral location, which was a space station orbiting a gas giant in an uninhabited system between Earth and collective space. Ambassador Wei led the human delegation, and he specifically requested that Sophie Hayes be included because he believed that the daughter of Connor Hayes would send a powerful symbolic message about humanity's determination and sacrifice. The Valorian delegation consisted of representatives from 7 of the 17 member species, and notably, the delegation did not include all species, which confirmed the intelligence about internal divisions within the collective. The negotiations were tense and difficult because the Valorian representatives were skeptical that a single planet species could offer anything of real value, and Wei countered by presenting data on human technological developments since first contact, including preliminary designs for improved shield generators and faster propulsion systems. What became clear during the talks was that the Valorian collective was not a single empire, but a federation of species with different interests, and some member species were expansionist and viewed humanity as a threat, while others were pragmatic and saw potential benefits in an alliance. On the third day of negotiations, the talks reached a complete impasse because the Valorian representatives demanded access to all human military technology as a condition for any alliance, and Wei refused, knowing that this would leave Earth defenseless. Sophie Hayes had been observing silently, but she requested permission to speak, and Wei granted it because he was curious what she would say, and Sophie addressed the Valorian delegation directly. She told them that her father had died fighting. Their fleet and thousands of her people had died defending their right to exist, and the Valorians had come to the solar system and threatened humanity with extinction, expecting them to submit, but humanity had proved them wrong. She continued by saying that the Valorians didn't understand humanity's true nature, because humans don't stay angry, and they adapt, and the Valorians had pushed humanity to the edge of extinction, and humanity had used that pressure to advance their technology by decades, and they had made humanity stronger. Then Sophie delivered her key point, which was that the galaxy was vast, and the Valorians themselves had said there were powers greater than the collective, and they were stretched thin, facing threats on multiple fronts, and humanity could be their ally on this frontier of space, bringing innovation and determination, and the ability to thrive under pressure. She finished by saying that humanity didn't want to join the collective, but wanted to stand beside it as partners, and the room fell completely silent. And then one of the Valorian representatives, who was from a species called the Keth, said that her words had merit and that she honored her father's memory with her courage. On Earth, the global vote on how to respond to the Valorian ultimatum reached its conclusion, and 73% of humanity voted to pursue the alliance of equals rather than submission or continued conflict, and the vote crossed all boundaries of nation and culture and ideology, and humanity had spoken with one unified voice. Within the Valorian collective, the debate was equally intense, and intercepted communications revealed heated arguments between member species, and the deciding factor came from a species called the Thuron, who had been part of the collective for 8,000 years, and their analysis concluded that humanity's rate of technological adaptation was unprecedented in galactic history. After 3 months of negotiations, an agreement was finally reached, and the Treaty of Mars established humanity as an independent ally of the Valorian collective, and the terms included technology exchange programs and joint defense agreements, and human representation in collective councils, and support for human colonization of new star systems, and a formal apology from the collective for the initial threat of extinction. President Martinez signed the Treaty of Mars in a ceremony broadcast across Earth and transmitted to every collective world, and General Cross stood beside her along with Ambassador Wei and Sophie Hayes. Martinez honored all who died defending Earth, and she spoke of Connor Hayes and Lucas Grant and Morris Green and Olivia Stone, and the thousands of others who gave their lives so humanity could remain free. Sophie returned to the memorial where her father's name was engraved, and General Cross accompanied her, and she placed her hand on the stone and told her father that they had done it and stayed free, and showed the galaxy who humanity really was. 6 months after the treaty was signed, the first joint human collective exploration mission launched, and Sophie served as military commander aboard a ship called the Pathfinder, carrying a crew of humans and 3 collective species, with a mission to explore frontier regions and establish new colonies. President Martinez stood in Earth's command center watching the Pathfinder depart, and she said that the final dawn was not humanity's end, but its beginning, and whatever came next, humanity would face it as they always had, which was defiant and determined and free.